Good evening. Good to see everybody. We're in lesson 12 in the Numbers 11 and 12 region of the text. We left off, I guess, right around question 2, answering the question, what is meekness? And we looked at that on Sunday, especially what Brother Blackaby had to say, and him quoting Barclay and W.E. Vine. And so hopefully a little bit of a better understanding or a good reminder of what meekness is. And it is one of those certainly underrated and underutilized qualities that Christians really need to make sure that they are possessing, because that is one of the stark differences that oftentimes sets us apart from the world, because so much of the world is not meek. And whenever there is sin or conflict within the Lord's people, oftentimes what's absent there is meekness. And so understanding that there can be disagreements, there can be things that we have to work through, but if meekness isn't there, if we're not being able to control our own spirit and have that strength under control, as he said there on page 60, knowing that we can still be right or still hold our convictions, but with the proper attitude, the proper tone. I remember reading a marriage book one time and said that you can be right and yet be wrong with the wrong tone, and certainly that's the case in any kind of argument or disagreement, that we can have those disagreements in a much more peaceful way than they oftentimes turn out. And certainly there is much conflict here as we get into Numbers 11. As it starts off, and we looked at, there was just a general complaint swirling around the people of Israel, right there in the first few verses. But then in verse 4, we read, the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. What was the significance of that statement that we talked about there?
It cost us nothing.
Cost us nothing, right? What else?
It wasn't free because they had to work for it.
Right, okay. So it cost us nothing wasn't really free because they were working for it. They were slaves. And
they didn't remember that. They remembered the food, but they didn't remember the slavery and the hard work and the complaints. They complained against the Egyptians to God.
Right. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into it. I don't think so. But verse 6, our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. And so it appears to me that they weren't even eating what God was providing. And I don't think God would provide something that would dry their strength up if the command is to march forward, to go towards the land of promise. And they're just choosing to act foolishly and not eating what God has provided. And then we get this description of the manna, that it was like coriander seed, just incredible in the way that it was brought about. It fell with the dew that would come of a night. The taste of it sounds pretty good to me. Taste of cakes baked with oil. And so God had already been providing for them, but as is often the case in our limited perspective at times, sometimes we just think the same old isn't good enough. And we talked about that some in the discussion about the quail, and we can talk about that a little bit more here in a moment, really, especially with verse 5. But let's ask question number 3. where we kind of left off. We already answered question 4 with the meat, fish, cucumbers, melons, and all the rest there in verses 4 through 6. But how is Moses' meekness demonstrated in his dealing with the various rebellions he faced?
He always went to God.
He always went to God, right?
Somehow, all of his feelings, he kept them under control.
Right. It is so easy for us to just fly off the handle and make the quick remark or the quick reaction to something said towards us, against us, and without thought of how we come off and how wise it would be if we would take a page out of Moses's approach and go to God first. You know, even if it was like we say the quick arrow prayer, Lord, give me strength in this, or help me watch my mouth and what I'm about to say, and think this through before I say it. We would probably do wonders in being able to make sure. I mean, it is to that effect what we read there in James chapter 1, isn't it? That let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Why? Because the anger of man does not. Do you remember? Produce the righteousness of God. Moses, standing in the physical representation of sorts of God for the people, God told him that you would be like God unto them. He is producing God's righteousness every time that he chooses to react in a way that is not going to stoop down to the level of the Israelites. He is choosing meekness. He is choosing his words wisely. And still yet we're going to read of even more petitions to God on behalf of the people when God is ready to consume more people and punish the whole kit and caboodle, and Moses is still petitioning, still showing that meekness, still showing a love for the people that he's leading, when everyone else would say, I mean, why not just go with plan B, C, or D at this point and let God just build the nation through you from now on? I mean, any one of us might come to that point, but that was not Moses' reaction over and over again. And so he turns to God, and and yet whenever we do read of his anger, so oftentimes hasn't it been that we've seen God's anger was kindled and Moses was angry or upset, right? It's not Moses is upset for his own offense that he's upset. And that is so, again, where we are as a culture is 9 times out of 10, the anger that we have in our lives is anger of just what I am personally feeling, not thinking about the indignation of God. Now, there are times where I'm feeling upset and God will be upset too because someone did something wrong, but I'm not thinking about how it's an affront to God, it's an offense to God, that they are sinning against God, and especially when someone curses God or makes a mockery of him or whatever. Those are the things that should truly upset me, instead of me being mocked or ridiculed. And yet a lot of times we get that reversed. Brother Jim.
You see, Moses was upset when God was upset almost every time in his life up until the last one. He was told to speak, and he struck.
Right.
Because the first time he struck the rock with the rod, but the second time he was told only to speak to the rock, and he didn't uphold God's power, his graciousness.
Yeah.
He looked to his own anger.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I mean, in a character study like this, and the same is true of back when we were talking a great deal about Joseph, that it's easy to elevate these men to a level that they almost seem Paul Bunyan-esque, of just untouchable and almost to the level of Jesus, and yet they're not. They all have these moments of weakness, although with Joseph, it's hard to tell where that was, at least for us. We don't really read much of anything negative about him, but we know that there were moments in his life that would have been the same because we have all sinned. But at the same time, understanding Moses had his weak point over and over again. He modeled the right attitude, but it was that one time, and certainly there's a lesson for us there too. Of it can be one time that we let our guard down, and yet we ruin our reputation, we ruin a situation because it was that one time that I couldn't control my anger, I couldn't control my tongue, and I, set something off that didn't have to go that direction. Mike?
I think the biggest problem was they were ungrateful.
Sure.
They were ungrateful, and I don't know why they couldn't petition God on their own behalf instead of going to Moses for that. I mean, he was God spoke working to him, but God still was their people. God could still hear their prayers.
Sure.
And it's kind of understandable because if you ever been on something called the Atkinson diet, where you can have all the meat you want, after about 3 weeks, you start looking at a piece of bread over that roll, and you start really lusting after that thing. You haven't, I want that bread. It's just.
So you have the reverse. It's the reversal for you with Atkins.
No, if you just
Yeah.
have the same, but they could have asked God, and the fact that they had just come from slavery and
Yeah.
bondage, they were ungrateful that they complained about it.
Mm-hmm.
Let their needs be known to God and whatever. They chose the wrong path.
Right.
They chose the wrong path.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, and it's easy to see from this vantage point of being able to read it and just, I mean, how many chapters back was it that you were delivered from Egypt? And we may think that way, but at the same time, if the book was written about us, I'm afraid of some of the things that would be written about me and other brethren in the moments in which we complain about things when God looks down and says, where do you live again? How many freedoms do you have? What, look at the building you're sitting in, and all of these things that what do I really have to complain about? And yet we find things, and certainly that's the troubling thing. So why did this craving, question 5 on page 64, why did this craving and complaint anger both God and Moses? We've been touching on this here, but we can expound on it a little bit more, I think. Leonard?
Well, God was very upset because all he had given them and provided for them, and even brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery, out of bondage.
Yeah.
Moses was displeased for that, and he was just a little bit overcome because the children of Israel had complained to him. He was sort of intermediary there between him and God, and so he complained to God that, I'm just overwhelmed with this. I just soon take my life. So
Right.
He was a little bit down over all of this complaints and everything.
Right. And so Moses is overwhelmed. The people are ungrateful, and what it seems they're placing emphasis on in this moment is food over freedom, physical over really what should be even more clear to them now, spiritual, of that we have a God, the true one and only God, who has delivered us, is continuing to provide for us, is making a way for us, and now they have the law and all of these things, and so every step of the way God is showing his presence with them, and yet here they are daydreaming over just a plate of food instead of I like the alliteration stuff, but food over freedom, and they're thinking about an enslaver over an emancipator. That's the difference. They want to go back to Pharaoh when they have God. It's just, again, on this side of things, it looks rather ridiculous, but I'm sure there's comparisons we could make to our own lives as well. And he does ask that question in the very next one in a moment. But I want to look at this a little bit more in depth in chapter 11. So Moses makes his appeal to God, or his plea, and really plea for relief is the ultimate one of, if this is what I'm going to have to deal with, I'd just rather not be here anymore. I'd rather you be done with me. And going back to what he had initially said of find someone else, he's ready for him to find someone else, but after making a valiant effort up to this point of trying to make things better. And so we see there in verse 16, then the Lord said to Moses, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel. I'm getting cross-eyed here. Really, let's go down to verse 18. Say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out at your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? And so what I was starting to read there in verses 16 and 17, we see 70 elders selected from those that were already elders to be in this position of authority with Moses to help alleviate Moses. But then going forward and dealing with the people and their cry for meat, we see that complaint responded to by God about the people there, verses 18 through 20. One thing I started thinking about and looking at this a little bit more is, could there be a sense of gluttony and selfishness as well in gathering so much and spreading it out for themselves in verse 32? It's unknown, I believe, as to what the plague was itself. We just read the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. But we see there, skipping down to verse 32, the wind comes, the quail come, and it is just an enormous amount of food. I have my study Bible up here to have these notes of just some additional facts to consider. It says that quail, small partridges, migrate north across the Sinai Peninsula in the spring and return in the fall. So although the Israelites had eaten some in the previous year, these were not a regular dish. The migration of the second year was such that the Israelites were able to catch enormous quantities of quail. They were piled 2 cubits or 3 feet high on the ground. Thus anyone could collect at least 10 omers, there in verse 32, which is roughly 60 bushels, or 480 dry gallons, or 2,200 liters. This greed was punished by a very great plague. And so the way it reads there in verse 32, and others can read from their translation. I've got ESV again. But verse 32, the people rose all that day and all night and all the next day and gathered the quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 omers. And so that minimum of 480 dry gallons, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. And so the way it reads there almost leads me to visualize people are just hoarding as much as they can for themselves and maybe not doing a collective pile or organizing it for all of the people, and they're just all gathering for themselves. I don't know if that is part of God's anger, or if it is just I'm going to make it come out of your nostrils, and then I'm going to send a plague on top of that. And I don't know if he's going to make roasted quail out of this or what, but whatever it was, God is just furious with them, and for good reason. Anybody else have any insight there, Billy?
The language that you see in the first part of chapter 11, where it says, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving.
Right.
And then later on it talks about the Lord was kindled against the people and struck down people with a very strong plague. Therefore the name of the place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, because the people buried there had the craving.
Right.
If you go over to Psalms chapter 78, verse 30, it says, before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths. So, I mean, he didn't kill everybody, but it looks like it's those that were craving those, there was a group of people there that was doing most of the complaining. And maybe that's the ones that he destroyed,
Okay.
those that were, and then those were probably the same ones that gathered a lot more than what they really had to have to be satisfied.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just reading the scriptures without going into a lot of extra
Sure.
other places.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to say exactly, but it ungratefulness, that just, again, almost the grass is greener on the other side, but you've already been on the other side and it wasn't greener. And so just the short memory that they are dealing with, and the ungratefulness that they are showing towards God. Jim?
Again, it shows a lack of trust in God, because he said not for 1 day, not for 5 days, not for 10 days, 20 days, but a whole month.
Yeah.
Why did they go gather so much the first day?
Yeah.
It's a lack of trust in God.
I could see that. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure they didn't have a bobcat out there to be able to scoop the quail and push it aside. So there would have had to be some work done for that much quail to be there. I mean, 3 feet high on the ground, and I mean, they would have to have places to be able to walk and get to where they needed to go. But if it was to that extent of they're trying to, warehouse as much as they can for their own selves, without considering, okay, God's told you how long this is going to come. You all are going to have quail the rest of your lives. I mean, of course, it would probably spoil, but I mean, enough to feed, thousands upon thousands. And did you notice also Moses' response to that in verse 21? This is a bit questionable from Moses, but at the same time, he's hearing the same announcement as everyone else, and Moses as a leader is having to kind of think from the logistical side of things too. And he says, but Moses said, the people among whom I am number 600,000 on foot, and you have said, I will give them meat that they may eat a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them and be enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them and be enough for them? And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's hand shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So now Moses, just coming off of really asking God to go ahead and take his life, is still seemingly reeling a bit and saying, I mean, how? How is this going to happen? I've got over 500,000 people just in, what do you say, 600,000 on foot, and that we read before about the 20-year-olds and up that were, I think, around that number as well. And so we're talking about a lot of people, and Moses just having a hard time wrapping his mind around it of how is this possible? I saw Charles.
It was an application for us and what we can learn from these people. They received a lot of physical blessings, but they couldn't look at them for what they were, blessings.
Yeah.
We have so many spiritual blessings from God, and we can't be happy with what God's given us. We are not satisfied any time with our status in life or what we have, our status in life. But we're blessed, and we need to recognize that, like these people. If not, we're going to be poor spiritually as they are.
Amen. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing this physical manifestation, this physical representation of really what we see all the time spiritually. Is not what God has said good enough? Is God's hand shortened to do what he said that he could do? Do we have to really reinvent other ways in which one can be saved, or one can, feel at peace with God? What God has said is what's going to happen, and not that we need to sit back and wait and see if it will happen. We need to trust that it's going to happen because he has said it, and he's proven in all of these other instances that his word is truth. So give some examples of things, question 6, give some examples of things that weak Christians today want that are a part of the world they left behind when they obeyed the gospel? What are some things that weak Christians today, really, any one of us in a weak moment, and we're just not going to generalize it to that, but any one of us in a weak moment, what is something that may tempt us to go back to? And you don't have to give any specifics of your own self, but just what do you notice among yourself or among others of temptations to go back to something you should have left behind?
Could be your friends.
Okay? Friends, that's a hard one, isn't it? Okay?
Or family.
Or family, that's true.
Any kind of sin that you could have left, drinking or stealing, lasciviousness, partying, sexual immorality, people with pregnant, they have, they gave that up, they're still getting to go back. So they goes back and remember and think more fondly of it and not think about the consequences of it that time. And again, there too, they're showing an ungrateful spirit toward God, what He has given us. And that's just, I guess it's just human nature that people who are weak in their faith will think those are the good old days, and now I'm a Christian, I've got to give that up and do this. And, it's the wrong, that's just ingratitude for Jesus Christ, for things I've done.
Right. Absolutely. Billy?
Well, I mean, one of the things that you see people before they sin is their time and dedication to God. I mean, when people start missing services and they're taking their families or they do different things that they want to do, entertainment. That just seems to be one of the things that first things that goes is come to church so that we can be entertained and do the things that we enjoy doing as a family or as a group or whatever, if we're part of a civic organization or some kind of community group or something. I mean, we do those things, then we're giving up our service to God, and then that puts us even in a further weakened state. But it's just like here, those people, there were faithful people there, but God had a way of making a selection all the way through time of separating out people that did not follow Him. This is an example here. I mean, even when Gideon was selecting soldiers, I mean, he had a way of separating out those that Gideon would know that God was behind them when they went to fight. So there's just ways that God put things out there or how He would separate people out. But it was always the people's choice on how they did things, just like today. We have a choice of what we do. But what's first? Is it the drinking or other pornography and stuff like that, or is it their attitude about our time and our love of doing something supersedes the love that we should have to God? I mean, when does that fail? We don't just automatically start going back into sin. You go back into it gradually. I mean, there could be times that you're tempted to big temptation. But 1 Corinthians tells you there's not any temptation that you cannot overcome.
Right. I think there's valid points there for sure. You think obviously there are outliers, but it seems, and I know my experience is limited compared to others, but it seems like whenever attendance does start slipping, there is always something behind the scenes going on more than just attendance. But even that priority, that no longer being a priority, to be with God's people and to worship God and to gather for study and edification and all of those things, when we no longer see the importance of that and we start replacing that priority with something else, or almost kind of negotiating and thinking that, 3 out of 4 weeks isn't bad that I'm there, or what have you, we're opening the door more than just a crack for the devil. We've let him right in, and certainly we've got to keep in mind all of these things that can sway us. But a lot of times it's whenever I start shifting my priorities, when it should have been Jesus from the start, and we remove him from that place, that we really get into trouble. But of course, as Mike touched on, lasciviousness, it could be especially for young people, and just really, my generation even, of just we live in the world of influencers. Everybody wants to be an influencer, or be somebody, and have the YouTube fame or whatever. And sometimes it's in the way we dress, the way we talk, the things we talk about, or what have you, and just trying to straddle the fence there, want some kind of notoriety. Wealth is obviously one that we want to, more than just pay off our debts, but we want to be able to live the lifestyle of the rich and famous, and still think that we can, be as faithful as we were when we didn't have as much. And we know what Jesus said. It's easier for a rich man to enter easier for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Saying it's hard because that is going to be a number one distraction for him. The rich farmer and the rich young ruler, and all of those examples of the priorities getting out of whack. That rich young ruler, you can just feel the pain of that story when you read it. And that line, he turned and went away sorrowful. Why? Because he was right there. He was on the precipice of truly committing himself to discipleship. Truly, where he was a rich young ruler and a leader in his own right, he was on the threshold of following the true leader, but it was that one thing he could not give up. And that's all it takes, isn't it? One thing that I'm not willing to give up and yield to God and say, I need to make him a priority, even over that one thing that is so tempting for me to hold on to. Did I see another hand somewhere? Okay. So, what is at the root cause of complaining? I think Mike touched on one. It's the same one I have. What is at the root cause of complaining?
Selfishness.
Selfishness. Okay? I have become the priority. And so, in other words, and I think we've said this before about sin, while we sin against God, a lot of times when we do sin, if not every time we do sin, it's almost as though we are putting ourselves in the place of God and saying, no, what I want to do right now in this moment is more important than my righteousness towards God. Now, we don't think that way in the moment a lot of times. If we did, hopefully we would stop ourselves. But it is in those moments where the temptation becomes too big and we've not gone to God, we've not been meek ourselves or humble ourselves, and we start thinking more about ourselves and how unfair something is, or how much we desire something over God, that we will start to complain. It is that selfishness, ungratefulness. A lot of times it comes in the form of comparing ourselves. How often do we get ourselves in trouble doing that? Comparing ourselves. I mean, that's what the Israelites were doing in just where they were to where they had been from. Right? They're comparing Egypt to their current situation, and instead of, as the saying goes, being in the moment and think about what has God done for you. I think Charles was pointing that out, of realizing just how blessed they really were. Anything else that seems to be at the root of complaining? Okay. So what did Aaron and Miriam want when they complained to Moses? As you go and you replay the very next chapter, it hits closer to home there with chapter 12 for Moses. What did Aaron and Miriam want when they complained to Moses?
They want some of the authority and power.
Okay. Yeah, they were hungry for power. They were tired of little Moses getting to be the boss, right? Miriam and Aaron, verse 1, spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Now, I have just a personal question myself. Had Moses heard of their speaking out, thus the explanation of his meekness in the very next verse? Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." And the three of them came out. Now it could be they were all in separate places, or Aaron and Miriam were together and Moses was somewhere else, and God heard Aaron and Miriam and he's calling them all out at the same time. Moses may not have heard the word against them, but we also hear this meekness, and maybe that is to set the table for what we read there in verse 13 of what Moses does for Miriam. But we see this explanation of Aaron and Miriam's selfishness and then Moses' meekness to really set the stage for just how different these siblings are from one another, at least in this moment. Jim?
The result of this makes me think that Miriam was more of a problem than Aaron was.
Yeah.
Because she's the one that got the leprosy, not him.
Right.
And it makes me think that she was feeling too much behind Aaron and Moses, that she wanted to be up there, up front with them. And I just felt like she had gotten completely out of step with herself.
Yeah. I think that's a fair assessment there. But it's clear Aaron learned, and I think Blackaby had made this point. Aaron had seen enough for himself to understand, and we have two stories now of Aaron especially that are not glowing whatsoever in dealing with the golden calf, and now with this. But read God's defense of Moses here in verses 4 through 9, and we'll close with this, and we'll pick up with question 9 on Sunday, Lord willing. But suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." And the three of them came out, and the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed." And so we can pick up more from that description of Moses and his chastisement of Aaron and Miriam. But it is one of those how dare you moments of showing you are not the leaders clearly for a reason, and here's the reason why. Moses is the leader, and it's not you. And certainly there's lessons to be learned there. Billy?
One more thing about, when Eldad and Medad, when they were doing their prophesying, Joshua was saying, "Hey, they're prophesying." And Moses said, "Hey, God wants to make everybody prophesy. That'd be great. Don't be trying to defend me.
Right.
That's God."
Right.
So that even shows another
That's a good point.
segment of meekness for Moses.
Yep, absolutely. All right, very good. We'll pick it up there on Sunday, Lord willing. Thank you all.